All right, man. Well,
Sweet.
welcome to the Outcast. This is that's the working title. Did I show you the?
You have showed me the logo.
Yeah, yeah. It took a little bit, but I'm really excited about that. Did you see the ship in the center?
I think you did show me a few work in progress shots that you were working on, and I think I saw one with the ship.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
I think last you showed me you were working on the chains a little bit.
Okay, gotcha. What's funny is like, I think I've got it all figured out, but the funniest part is like based on when I'm planning on releasing all these.
Mm-hmm.
This is gonna be people are gonna hear this like 2-3 months from now. And so, I mean, just based on the whole podcasting, like, what do you call the plan that the free plan that I'm set up with? So, but I figure I release them like break the podcast bits up into like 20-30 minute chunks and then release like one once a week. Because I'm only allotted what 2 hours and something minutes each month, and so I figure if I have like I think it's something like that. But break them up into like 20-30 minute chunks.
Okay.
Release one once a week, just to have a more consistent schedule. And then hopefully eventually I'll just release the whole thing when I'm much more productive with this. But yeah, that's the plan.
Good stuff.
Yeah, I'm excited. But yeah, man, how you been?
I've been good. It is still getting into the swing of full-time adulting. So that's been fun. But I'd say I am, as our good friend Patrick Smith would put it, blessed and highly favored. So
all right, yeah.
I had to explain what that meant to a coworker the other day because he was like, highly favored, what does that mean? And I'm like, highly favored by the Lord. And he's like, well, doesn't God not play favorites? And I'm like, shoot, I didn't think about that. I think it's more of a posture of receiving while realizing that I don't necessarily deserve it, like
True.
He is showing a kind of favoritism, grace, and mercy towards me, where does that kind of make sense? It's not necessarily a like, oh, look at me, I'm favored by the Lord. It's more like, I'm favored by the Lord,
Yeah, it's more of a reverence sort of thing. There's also something to be said for you're not a rabbit.
Yeah.
The famous Jason Whalen, God feeds birds, and then the next implication is that but we're highly favored over the birds.
That's true. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
How much more if God feeds the sparrows? How much more are you loved by Him, or however that passage in Matthew goes?
Yeah. No, yeah. It's so funny because like, I love the Bible. I cannot memorize it to save my life.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm just like, it generally says this. Like, and I know that's not as good as just quoting it, but I mean, I feel like it almost, to a certain extent, it makes it a bit more conversational.
Yeah.
And I mean, especially if you're quoting New King James or
oh yes, it's good
just some old English. It's like, hold on.
The thing is, when it comes to scripture, because like when I was growing up, I memorized out of the NIV, and I don't read out of the NIV that much anymore. Besides, right now I'm actually reading through the Gospel of Luke, through the Word for Word Bible comic, which you and I have talked about.
Yeah.
But I actually just shared that with another guy from our church. But that has been a real blessing. I gotta share those with you. He just finished the Kickstarter for the Book of Acts, and that's going to be shipping out in a couple months.
That's going to be a crazy one.
And my name may or may not be in the back as the list of supporters. So that was pretty cool. I'm like, oh, sweet. But yeah, he uses, and I forget the gentleman's name that does it. He's a British guy, but he was able to get a hold of the NIV translation to use for that. because you're having to deal with publishers when you're dealing with translations.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why the King James Bible is so popular is because it's not beholden to any publisher, because it's so stinking old and it's basically public domain. So I
Okay.
could, if I wanted to, I could go take the King James translation, create a book, publish it and sell it, and I don't have to worry about asking anybody for the rights to it. Whereas if I wanted to
Interesting.
do that with the ESV, if I take let's say I wrote a book, right? And I wanted to quote scripture in it. Well, depending on how much scripture I quote from the ESV translation, I'm going to have to go to, and I forget who does ESV, but I think it's Crossway Publishing. I'm going to have to go to Crossway. Don't quote me on that, by the way. It might be somebody else. And basically ask them for permission. Isn't that wild?
Even if you like cite it correctly.
So so it depends on how much I quoted, right? Like if I'm only doing a few quotes here and there, they really don't care.
Okay.
But like if I'm doing
Like
a
whole passages.
like huge commentary where I've got big chunks of scripture that I'm quoting, that's when you want to start worrying about that kind of stuff.
That's so crazy.
And that's one of the reasons why, if you run into people that are like super enthusiastic and passionate about the King James version, it's not necessarily because I used to think it was kind of crazy, like, oh, like why are they so obsessed with the King James Bible? Well, one of the reasons why they like it so much is it's one of the only translations that doesn't have that publisher bias, because it came from a time
Gotcha.
where,
Okay.
like, if I wanted to create my own translation, let's say I really liked and I do really like this translation, but I really liked the NIV, but I wanted to make some tweaks here and there because I wasn't a fan of some of the translation choices that the translation team made, right?
Mormons.
Let's say I wanted to do that, but I'd have to change enough to warrant, because you still have copyright law that you're dealing with. And so because of that, like, you might have somebody that just wants to make slight changes, but in order to publish it, you have to make more changes to make it distinct enough from the other translations. And so that changes your translation philosophy a little bit.
Yeah. I heard some quote of like, it was like, no, it was some sort of, I think it was in like some sort of Russian investigator in the Soviet Union under Stalin, and he was basically saying like, give me the incentive and I'll show you the crime. And in a similar sense of like, show me the incentive of like, give some incentive to everyone has a price in that sense. And so like, once it gets to a certain point, I mean, everyone is corruptible. I mean, that's the fall of man in a way. Yeah.
And so that's why when you hear people talk about modern translations with a more critical lens, that's probably one of the big reasons right there. And, I don't want to throw too much shade at modern translations, because I do really think some of them are pretty spectacular and cool. But it's like anything, you go into it knowing that, like, hey, there's probably going to be some translator bias in here. It's good to read multiple versions of scripture to have a more rounded view of what's going on. Yeah, all of that's
or
to
just
say.
learn Greek.
Yes, exactly. I have seen, there are some pastors that will translate from the Greek as they are preaching from the pulpit, which I think is kind of wild.
Yeah. It's a heck of a skill. Like my the Bible teacher that of the camp that I typically go to over the summer is he's so smart. But he's got, like, whenever he's preaching on a certain passage, he has the English version, then he has I think the Latin version and then also the Greek version.
Oh,
And
wow.
so he can go back and forth between all three. I know it's three. I can't remember if it's Latin or not, but or no, I think it's Hebrew.
Okay.
Um,
That makes slightly more sense.
Yeah.
Because Latin is important to the Catholic tradition.
yeah,
But with the Protestant tradition, it's a little less weight is placed on it, just
For
because
sure.
it's not the original language it was written in. But I still think it's important from the standpoint of that's the language of the Roman Empire, you know?
yeah.
Like,
Well, and so much of our English language so much of most languages come from some sort of Latin
right.
origin, and I mean that's why they're called Romantic languages.
Yep.
It's like they're of a from an origin that is based in the Roman language, and which is Latin. Um, but I mean, I can even list all the
There's a few of them.
Romance languages. I mean, there's so many. I mean, English is kind of like a conglomeration of so many languages, and a lot of ancient languages in particular. But I mean, there's some. I mean, there's some Greek like more like suffixes, prefixes, not necessarily like the whole word, but they're based in the more like the root words are Greek, the root words are Latin, and that's part of the reason why, at least at Sloka, they taught us a lot of Latin, so that then when you go into the real world, it's like, okay, there's a basis for, even if you don't know the word itself, you know the root from where it came from, and then therefore you can kind of deduce somewhat of what the meaning of the word means.
Yeah, that
which
made
is super interesting.
Spanish a bit easier. Not that I don't know Latin, but like there's enough, like there's certain words in Spanish that are similar enough to English where it's like, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because we come from the same common ancestry with the languages.
Yeah. Same linguistic common ancestry.
Yes.
There's I mean, it's also something to be said for living in Central Coast California, where it's like,
yes,
there's quite a few Spanish speaking people. Yeah,
it's I know Mr. Schmidt, my Spanish teacher, will give me crap for saying this, but we'd speak a lot of Spanglish in my first job because everybody knows you either know enough Spanish but not enough to speak it, and the people you're talking to know enough English but not enough to speak it that well, and so you just figure out how to communicate and somehow it works.
Yep, that's the restaurant business for you.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
So
talking to Dan, he was on one of the podcasts that we recorded, and only one of the tracks recorded. And I was so mad because it was a really good one. So we got to redo that one. But he's actually learned a significant amount of Spanish just from working so many restaurant jobs and just chatting with the cooks.
Well, it's the classic principle of learn by doing.
Yeah, exactly. One of my friends from martial arts, we can get into martial arts and that whole conversation in a bit. But she was doing foreign exchange student in Germany, and she didn't speak a word of German when she went there. And her legitimate plan was show up and learn it.
I believe it.
And just simply by exposure, just learn it. And she did fine.
Yeah.
I mean, she's stupid smart as well. But it's so funny. Her and her little sister are the quietest, like, most, like, sweet little girls you'll ever meet. Sweet little blonde girls. But they're both black belts.
Yeah. Oh, I believe it.
And so,
well, you remember, you're talking to a guy who was trained by a lady, right?
Right.
Benji's mom. Don't mess with her.
Yeah.
So.
Which is so funny because she's so unassuming. She's so unassuming in her, like, I mean, what's also another funny aspect to the martial arts world is everyone's in a gi,
Mm-hmm.
and then you go outside of that, and it's like you hang out with those people outside of
And
the
it's like
dojo.
they're wearing normal street clothes. What's going on?
Yeah, and you actually get a sense of a bit more of their personality in from a fashion standpoint.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, so that's like what you're kind of like your life is like outside of the dojo. Because when you're in the dojo, it's just you're in a gi, you got your different belt ranks, and that's as far as you get personality wise.
Right.
In a fashion style, I mean, you can get like how they wear their gi and that sort of thing, but I mean, the I just remember there's definitely a few people, because most of the people that were at my dojo were I hardly saw them outside of the dojo like at all. I went to school with a few of them, but other than that, like pretty much nobody. But then we'd have some sort of like pizza party. Like I think we only did it like once or twice when I was doing it, or while I was doing martial arts. But it was like you actually see people in normal clothes, and you're like, that's so weird. Like that's not at all as I was expecting.
Right. It's kind of like at work when during busy season when we'd come in. For context, I work in public accounting, so we just got finished with busy season. And Saturdays we would have to work, but we'd wear casual clothes. So I'd come in with like a t-shirt, a baseball cap, and everybody's freaking out like, "Oh my gosh, James, you look so different when you're not wearing a tie." And I'm like, "Yeah."
Not in your 3-piece suit.
Yeah, and then like one of the partners would walk in with like gym shorts on. I'm like, this is hilarious.
You're like, I don't want to see that much leg on you.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
So.
Oh man. Oh, yeah, let's get into the martial arts world. So you did, you did martial arts for how?
I did it for about 7.5 years, give or take. And I studied martial art known as Keichu-Ryu. It's related to Keichu-Do. It is, for all intents and purposes, a mixed martial art. It was developed by a guy, we refer to him by his title as Soka. But you want to know what his real name is?
Of course.
Okay, dude, you're not gonna believe this.
It's gonna be like Bob.
Whoever this guy's parents were, I don't know what they were thinking, but his name is literally Karl Marx. So that's why we call him Soka.
That's probably a good decision.
That was we never referred to him. Yeah, it was always Soka. And I never got to meet him because he unfortunately passed away before I got my black belt.
You studied the martial art of Karl
Marx. Karl Marx, yeah, I know. But he was...
Oh my gosh.
So this guy had an interesting story.
No kidding.
So he was basically a former gangster living in Louisiana. Yes, I know. But he studied a bunch of martial arts, basically... came up with his own mixed martial art, and he was saved. So he became a Christian, and that flipped his life around. And so rather than learning how to fight so he could do evil things, he was teaching a
Become a Russian dictator.
Yeah, I know, right? He became a women's self-defense instructor. And that slowly, specifically women to start off with, and then he started bringing in guy students, and then it basically turned into what it is today, which is basically a full-fledged martial art. And so my sensei was one of his students, Rebecca Pruitt, who is the mother of the man, the myth, the legend himself, Benji Pruitt.
Definitely gonna have him on at some point.
Oh, you need to. But yeah, I trained under her for around 7.5 years, got my black belt. I was one of her last students because she retired a couple years after I passed my black belt test. And so
she's like, I can't do it anymore.
Yeah,
James, you did.
I know James took too much out of her. But it gets a little confusing because there's two different variations of Keichu. I don't know how these came to be, but they're just kind of there. There's Keichu Ryu and then there's Keichu Do. Keichu Do is what Benji has a black belt in, as well as my brother-in-law, small world. But he also was a Keichu. He did not study under my sensei. He studied under a different one, who also trained under Soka. So this is when I found that out, because my brother-in-law is from Southern California. Like we're, in two separate worlds, pretty much. And the fact that he studied this same art was, I don't know, just made it feel a bit more big to me,
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool.
Because it feels super niche, because I'll tell people like, oh, what martial art do you study? And I'm like, oh, Keichu Ryu Karate. And they're like, Gesundheit. What is that? Yeah, so that was basically the only sport I did growing up, was martial arts. And
did you do tournaments?
I did.
Okay.
I did do a few tournaments. I think the highest I ever went was like regionals. So I wasn't super into the competitive scene. My brother-in-law definitely was. He went to world champions.
Oh, dang.
Yeah. So that was...
Was this for kata or kumite?
This was for sparring, I'm pretty sure. I don't know if he competed in kata or not. Point sparring. So
Gotcha. Yeah.
That was fun. I do miss point sparring. That
Dude,
was
so fun.
It was great.
So fun. As like a 10 to like 13-year-old, I definitely didn't exactly realize that it was like not actually fighting.
Oh yeah. It's not practical at all. It's like fencing with your fists.
A little bit. Yeah. But
same principle.
A little, yeah, of like there's so much more of an honor system of like we're trying to like show that we could, but we're gonna restrain ourselves and not actually just obliterate the other person.
Right. Though there was some of that happening too.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Especially if it was just free sparring. We called them purple belt smackdowns. And the purple belt smackdown was kind of a rite of passage
for this.
where if you were a purple belt, you were thrown into the center of the ring, and all the other students would basically gain up on you, and you'd have to fight them all at once.
Oh my gosh.
It was kind of brutal.
How many people were in this class?
I forget. We usually only had like a couple, like 2 to 3 people. But I remember when I was a purple belt, I don't know if I ever did one where I was in the center, but I remember as this little yellow belt, still in elementary school, Sensei thought I was ready to go up against one of the brown belts who was, I think, in high school at the time. And I was part of the purple belt smackdown. So he was fighting, a couple other students, and I came in from behind, and I was kind of like, oh, I'm going to get this guy, right? Yeah. He swung around and got me straight in the nose, dude. It was a spiritual experience, let me tell you. That guy walloped me.
Nice.
So, but
I'm just picturing like Doctor Strange. Open your eye.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I actually did it as a purple belt, but I do.
How many belts were in this?
I forget. Okay, so there was. Here, let's just go through them. White, yellow with a white stripe, solid yellow, orange, which is a weird one because you can actually skip it, and I ended up skipping it. Then blue, then green, then purple, then brown with a black stripe, and then brown with 2 black stripes, and then black. I know, it's really confusing.
Were the stripes on like the tail ends of the?
Yeah, so there, we had a stripe system. So for each of the belts, typically you'd have to earn 4 stripes to progress to the next one. But brown belt was unique because each stripe had basically the same learning content as an entire belt level. And so those stripes were special because it signified a new belt almost.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And then there's, the different degrees of black belt, which I'm whatever the lowest tier is. Like that was something I never super got into, because again, Sensei retired shortly after, so I didn't do much. After I had gotten my black belt, I helped instruct a few classes.
Sensei retarded.
Sensei retired. Oh,
I was like, what?
hopefully I didn't actually say that. No, Sensei retired. She retired. And so you have that, but we also have in our system, the highest rank you can achieve is actually a red belt. So we have a belt above black, and Soka was famous for having the same red belt for decades. And because he never replaced it, it was more of a pink belt than a red belt. And you could tell where he chambered his fist because it was super faded on the sides.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
No, yeah. And if you're not gaining too much weight, like, it's going to be the same.
Yep.
You should be pretty good at tying that belt in the same way.
Every single time.
Yeah. No, yeah, because I remember my sensei, he, like, based on how much, like, he'd wear that same belt. I mean, shocker. But and like how he'd tie it in the same way every time, unless it was a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu day with a different tie, which is kind of fun. But the edges of the belt were so frayed because it was just the friction of the belt rubbing against each other as he yanked it tight on the every day.
Yeah.
I mean, he did, I think it was either 4 or 5 days a week, and then every once in a while he did a belt test on Saturdays, and then I think like once a month or something like that. And then he switched that later, which much to the chagrin of most of my friends. But he went from a individualized belt ranking, or not belt ranking system, but so at our dojo it was also a mixed martial art.
Okay.
But we did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, karate, Aikido, Taekwondo, trapping, which is just what he called the Kung Fu.
Interesting.
Yeah. But it was more of the understanding I guess the philosophy was you have your kicking range, punching range, trapping range, which is just elbows, knees, and then
grappling.
Well, and then you have judo, which is taking them to the ground in various manners, and then
that's very similar to how ours was set up too.
Yeah, and then but you also have the Aikido of joint manipulation, which is kind of it flips between the like judo and like punching ranges a little bit in there, because you can bring them out and take them down in like a few moves. But all that to say is the whole philosophy was like, I can't remember exactly who created it, but I think it was my sensei's sensei.
Mm-hmm.
I think just a similar story.
Yeah.
I don't exactly know what the name of
the art was.
Yeah, I think we just call it mixed martial arts, because it was a blending of all 6 of these disciplines. But basically, because it was a blending of these 6 disciplines, we had 6 different stripes that he just I think he just cut duct tape in a certain way.
Yep.
That you just wrap.
It's the classic, cut the tape like electrical tape or whatever. Yeah, exactly, I know what you're talking about.
But then we also had, it was, I think it's either 13 to 15 or 15 to 17 different belts, depending on your age group.
Okay.
So you had like the peewees that had like an extra 2 to 3 belt ranks that they could go through, and then everyone else had, I think, around 15 belts.
Okay.
But it's funny that you mentioned that purple was way higher, because for us, purple is the third belt that you get to.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, purple belt that's kind of high up in our system.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, which makes sense being that it's freaking the royalty color.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah. It's like right before brown.
Yeah.
For us.
Which is, yeah. And then we had, for under 18-year-olds, in brown and red were interchangeable.
Interesting.
So red just meant you're a brown belt, but you're under 18.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah, which is kind of weird.
Because in our system, that's like, it was a rare sight to see a red belt. And when you did, you're like, whoa, that person's like grandmaster level, you know?
Yeah. They can beat me up by looking at me.
Pretty much.
But yeah, and then that kind of tradition of the 18-year-old shift is kind of kept in the black belt range of when you're under 18 and you get your black belt, you get a black belt with a white stripe going around the whole thing.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah. And then black belt is just black belt.
Solid black.
Yeah.
Dang, so I would have had a black belt with a white stripe if I was in your system. Because I got my black belt when I was a junior in high school.
Okay.
So I was like really close to 18, but not quite.
Yeah. There was, I think the youngest black belt kid that we had was either that friend that I was talking to you about, her sister, or one of our other friends who was around, I want to say 14, 15, 16 age.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they were super young. I mean, super knowledgeable.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the joke with those two girls of like, there's no one I wish would try and harm more than those two girls, just because I want to see them just whoop their butts. Just because I don't like. I know that they're gonna be fine.
Yeah.
I just want to watch whoever tries to mess with them just absolutely get destroyed.
Yeah, that's funny.
But I mean, yeah, I miss martial arts so much.
I do
there's
too,
there's so many benefits to it, like
the discipline, the kind of hierarchy where you're respecting other people. Yeah. I miss every time a black belt would enter the dojo, and I got to experience the receiving end of this a couple times, which is pretty cool. But everybody stops what they're doing, no matter what it is, stands up and then bows as they enter the dojo. And it was cool to learn something that required so much focus and discipline, but it was also, it could be a very humbling experience too. We were talking about purple belts earlier, right? When I was a purple belt, I kind of thought a little too highly of myself. I'm like, oh, I'm a purple belt now, I could take people on. And we were doing a fight night. We were doing a fight night at a dojo in Santa Maria, one of our sister dojos. And I was fighting a guy that trained under Soka and was a brown belt. But this guy, he was a bit of an older gentleman, at least compared to me at the time, because I was a young whippersnapper, And
you're such an old soul.
But I'm fighting this guy, and I was able to beat him in a sparring match, and I felt pretty good. I'm like, oh yeah, look at that. I wasn't gloating visibly, but in my head, I was kind of like, oh, look at that. I beat a guy who trained under Soka. So then the sensei Travis, looked at me and he goes, okay, you're going to fight me now. Oh my gosh. He destroyed me. And I'm never going to forget that experience. And even afterwards, my dad was like, oh my gosh, it was like watching a spider, messing around with a fly before it's about to eat it.
This concludes part 1 of my episode with James McDowell. In the next episode, we'll discuss the morality and lessons to learn from martial arts, masculinity, and proper relationships.